Hi everyone, I'm Alana from Kids Read to Kids, and it's time to start Chapter 2 of Read All About It by Valerie Tripp. So, let's get started. Chapter 2. Kit's real name was Margaret Mildred Kittredge. She was named after her mother and an aunt of her dad's. But when she was very little, her dad used to sing her a song that went like this. Pack up your troubles in your old kit bag and smile. Boy, smile. It was a song he learned when he was a soldier fighting in the Great War. Kit loved it. She'd beg Dad, "Sing my song! Sing the Kit song!" Pretty soon, everyone began to call her Kit, which was also short for Kittredge, and the name stuck. Kit didn't like the name Margaret Mildred anyway. It didn't fit her. It was too flouncy. Kit was not a flouncy girl. Kit was finishing her newspaper when she heard the car horn's cheery honk honk that signaled her favorite moment of the day. Dad was home from work. Kit snatched up her newspaper, flew downstairs, and burst out the door, calling to Dad, "Look, I've got a newspaper for you today." "Oh ho," said Dad. His blue eyes were twinkly. He smiled a broad smile as he took Kit's newspaper and handed her the real one. He read Kit's headline in a booming voice. "The Howards are coming." Then he glanced at Kit and spoke in his normal voice. "Are they coming for dinner?" "Nope," said Kit. "They're coming to stay." Kit noticed, much to her surprise, that Dad's smile faded. When Dad spoke, his voice sounded funny, as if he was trying too hard to be hearty. "Well," he said, "that is big news. Come on, sweetheart, let's go get the details from your mother." Grown-ups are funny, Kit thought as she walked along next to Dad. They don't react the way you expect them to. Anyone would think that Dad was not pleased to have the Howards coming to stay. But why on earth wouldn't he be? 2 days later, Kit and Ruthie were sitting on the front steps waiting for Sterling and Mrs. Howard to arrive. Ruthie was reading Beauty and the Beast, and Kit was looking at the pictures in her book, Robin Hood. Kit longed to sleep in a treehouse high up near the sky, surrounded by leaves, like Robin Hood and his merry men did. She had spent many hours drawing plans for a treehouse that she and Ruthie could build. Kit was not very good at sketching. Her drawings always looked like doghouses stuck up in trees. They didn't look anything like the treehouses in Sherwood Forest. "I bet," said Kit, "that Sterling can help us build a treehouse." Said Ruthie, with the tiniest hint of irritation at being interrupted when she was deep into the story of Beauty and the Beast. It was hot, and the girls were licking chunks of ice that had been chipped off the big block of ice in the icebox. Kit's ice chunk had melted to a sliver when at last a cab pulled up to the end of the driveway. Kit and Ruthie stood up and waited politely on the front steps. The cab door opened, and Mrs. Howard and a boy got out. When she saw Sterling, Kit felt as if someone had dropped her ice chip down her back. She was so surprised. Sterling stood next to the cab on two of the skinniest legs Kit had ever seen. He was short and pale and skinny all over. His head looked too big for his scrawny neck. The screen door opened, and Mother came out of the house. She stood between Kit and Ruthie and put her hands on their shoulders. "Mother," whispered Kit indignantly, "Sterling's a shrimp." "Now, Kit," said Mother, "Sterling is small for his age because his health is delicate, but I'm sure he's a very pleasant fellow." Gently, she pushed the girls forward. "Come along, ladies," she said. "Let's go greet our guests and make them feel welcome." Kit and Ruthie and Mother walked down the steps and toward the driveway. Mrs. Howard and the cab driver were unloading boxes and suitcases from the cab. Sterling just stood there. "Oh," said Mrs. Howard, all aflutter. "Margaret, you are such a dear to have us." She turned to Sterling. "Shake hands with Mrs. Kittredge, Lammy," she said, "and say hello to Kit and Ruthie." Sterling shook Mother's hand and nodded at the girls. He looked even worse close up. He had colorless hair, colorless eyes, and a red, runny nose. Kit towered over him, and Ruthie could have made two of him, he was so puny. "Oh dear," fussed Mrs. Howard. "All of this excitement is not good for Sterling, the poor lamb. He'll have to lie down right away and rest." "Of course," said Mother. "Come with me and we'll get him settled." Kit and Ruthie watched them go inside. Well, said Kit, he's a disappointment. Ruthie shrugged. Then she said, Of course, in fairy tales, you learn not to judge by appearances. Lots of times, perfectly nice people are under a spell. But over the next few days, Kit's disappointment stayed. When she and Ruthie invited Sterling to run through the sprinkler with them, Mrs. Howard said, Sterling can't get wet because he might catch a chill, and Sterling can't play in the yard because he's allergic to bee stings. Pretty soon, Kit abandoned any idea of Sterling helping with the treehouse, and she gave up inviting him to do anything, because the answer was always, Sterling can't. At first, Kit thought Mrs. Howard was making the whole thing up about how fragile Sterling was. It wasn't as if he had a sickness like rickets or scurvy or any of the really interesting diseases Kit knew about from reading pirate stories. Sterling didn't even have any spots or rashes. However, after he'd been at the Kittredge's house a week, Sterling got truly sick. Though it was only a cold, he did have a fever and a terrible cough. Mrs. Howard said that he had to stay in bed and have all of his meals brought to him on a tray. Kit could hear Sterling coughing and sniffling and blowing his nose all day long. Everyone had to tiptoe past the door to his room so they wouldn't disturb Sterling in case he was napping. Kit held her nose when she passed by, because the hall outside his room smelled strongly of Vicks Vapor Rub, even though the door was always shut. But one afternoon, Kit noticed that the door to the guest room was open. She sneaked a peek inside. Sterling was propped up on the pillows, and Mrs. Howard was nowhere to be seen. Of course, it was hard to see anything in the room. It was dark because the shades were pulled down. Kit stood in the doorway and looked at Sterling's moon-white face on the pillow. Gosh, it sure is stuffy in here, Kit said to Sterling. Don't you want me to open the window or something? Sterling nodded. Kit opened the window a crack so that a breath of air and a thin line of sunlight came through. That's better, she said. Kit turned to go. She was halfway to the door when she saw a photograph next to Sterling's bed that stopped her in her tracks. Hey, she said, is that Ernie Lombardi, the catcher for the Reds? Sterling's round eyes were as unblinking as an owl's as he looked at Kit. His nose was stuffed up, so his voice sounded weirdly low and husky. Schnoz, he croaked. For a second, Kit didn't understand. Then she laughed and nodded. Schnoz, she said. That's Ernie Lombardi's nickname because he has such a big nose. In answer, Sterling blew his nose, which made a nice honking sound. Kit laughed again. Ernie Lombardi is my favorite player on the Cincinnati Reds, she said. He's the reason I'm a catcher. Did you know that Ernie's the biggest guy on the Reds? 6'3", whispered Sterling hoarsely. 230 pounds. Right, said Kit, delighted. She rattled on. It's funny that you like him, she said, because he's so big and you're so little. That's why, said Sterling simply. He didn't sound the least bit offended, even though right after she spoke, Kit realized that she'd said something she shouldn't have.
You know what? Said Kit, suddenly inspired. I have a newspaper article about Ernie Lombardi. It has a photograph of him holding 7 baseballs in one hand at the same time. It used to be tacked up on my wall. My mother wouldn't let me put it back up after my room was painted pink this summer, but I bet I can find it. Want to see it? Sterling nodded vigorously, and Kit noticed that his eyes weren't colorless at all. They were gray. Okay, she said. I'll get the article and you can read all about it. Kit tore back to her room, rummaged through the drawers of her desk, and found the scrap of newspaper. She raced to Sterling's room, shouting, I found it!
Kit flung the door open and bam! The door hit Mrs. Howard, who was standing right inside with a silver tray in her hands. My land! Shrieked Mrs. Howard. She lurched forward, and the tray, which had one of Mother's best china teacups and saucers on it, went flying. The hot tea sloshed out all over the rug. The cup hit the floor and shattered, and the tray clanged to the ground with a noise like cymbals. Oh dear, fussed Mrs. Howard. At the same time, Sterling started to cough loudly. Kit tried to apologize in a voice louder than his coughs, and Charlie appeared and added to the commotion by asking, What happened? What's all the noise? They were all talking at once when Mother came in. Good gracious, she said above all the racket. Now what? Everyone stopped talking, even Mrs. Howard. Will someone please tell me what's going on? Asked Mother, not sounding at all like her usual serene self. Everyone looked at Kit. Kit knew that her mother disliked messes, so she tried to explain how this one was just an accident. I was coming in here to show Sterling my picture of Ernie Lombardi, she said, and I didn't know that Mrs. Howard was right behind the door. I was in a hurry, and Mother held up her hand to stop Kit. Don't tell me, she said. I can imagine the rest. She shook her head. How many times have I told you to slow down and watch where you're going, Kit? I'm sorry, said Kit. Mother stooped down to pick up the broken cup. Just look at what you've done, she said. Kit was shocked. It wasn't like Mother to scold her so sharply. But it wasn't my fault, she protested. It was an accident. It was nobody's fault. Nobody's fault, repeated Mother. And yet look at the mess we are in. She looked up at Kit. Please go now, she said. I'll help Mrs. Howard clean up. And Kit, dear, please don't barge in here bothering Sterling and making messes anymore. But I didn't, Kit began. That's enough, Kit, said Mother. Go now. Kit gave up. She turned on her heel and stormed back to her room. Kit rolled a piece of paper into the typewriter. In capital letters, she typed her headline, It's Not Fair. So that was chapter 2 of Read All About It. I'm Alana from Kids Read to Kids, and please go to chapter 3 if you liked this one in the next video. We also have corresponding lesson plans for each chapter with games, active listening prompts, and creative writing questions. Thank you so much and happy reading.